talk is titled A Poetics of Learning, Teaching, Aikido, and Experience. I dedicate this talk in memory of the late Mrs. Padma Sastry, Amma to Sandeep, Shaila, and Sanjal, and also Amma to my family and me. At the time Sandeep Sastry requested the following talk from me, Amma reappeared to us in living bloom and beauty in our backyard garden. Thank you. As for many of us who have become teachers, my choice of this profession began in my admiration for memorable teachers. I've had some extraordinary teachers and pedagogical models to teach me. Their lessons have not been easy. For more than a year now, beginning before the pandemic hit us worldwide, many of my Amherst College classmates have been engaged in a virtual reunion by email, and this has allowed us to reflect on the education we shared back then, now over 50 years ago. Amherst College was ranked the best in America, which at that time meant an all-male, small college of about 1,200 students in all, 300 of us in a class of 1968. Soon after our arrival in September 1964, we were told something unusual. We were an experimental class, a diversely chosen one, when diversity meant variations in educational backgrounds in private and public schools, parents' educational and occupational backgrounds, socioeconomic status, and to the small degree that the college could muster at that time, racial and ethnic variations. This diversity was called geographical distribution, a salient characteristic of our class. The college used this show of openness in selections of students for admissions in large part to suggest to high school counselors in the New England and Atlantic coast that Amherst was not so elitist, not so very difficult to get into as they complained, their best boys rejected from admission every year. I later learned that the dean of admissions, the best in his profession, boasted to high school counselors that Amherst had even admitted to the class of 68 the son of a watercress farmer in Hawaii. A watercress farm, for God's sake, in Hawaii. And yes, this boy speaks English. It made me feel like a freak. Today, remembering our own experience at the college through lenses of hindsight, our classmates' learning about ourselves is refreshed. What I now have to say, therefore, is still fresh. While the college made us all feel insecure about whether we were among the usual top grade students in an Amherst class or were the diverse experimental ones, and at the same time boasted about our diversity, the academic curriculum leveled us completely. With few exceptions, we were all required to take the core courses. They were courses in English composition, physics, calculus, history, the humanities, a course that in America used to be called the study of great books. And we had a sixth course, our only choice, and it had to be of a foreign language for fulfilling a language requirement. Now, 56 or 57 years later, our English 1 and 2 courses in writing loom large as the ones some of us are still trying to pass, to figure out. We were told in the first class meeting that we would be writing 3 papers a week, say about a page and a half each. The theme for the first semester would be masks. These announcements stunned us. 3 papers a week, one due in every class meeting. If I were writing a log first 2 weeks of our college years, it may have looked and sounded something like this. Monday, September 7th, 1964. First class in college, English 1. We would be writing 3 papers a week in English 1 and about the same in English 2 next spring. The theme for the fall semester will be masks. No further explanation of this was given. Then we were given the first exercise, the assignment for the first paper, due 2 days later, and I paraphrase. Oscar Wilde wrote that the first duty of any man is to assume a pose. What the second duty is, no one yet has figured out. What does it mean to assume a pose? Do you agree with Wilde? Due, Wednesday, September 9th. Wednesday, September 9th. Handed in paper 1. Received assignment for paper 2. Imagine a world in which people did not assume poses. Describe that world. How does it compare with a world of masks and poses? Due, Friday, September 11th, and we students were tired of the semester-long theme already. Friday, September 11th, handed in paper 2. Sample paper 1 papers chosen by the professor were critiqued severely in class. They were copied without the author's names on them. We received the assignment for paper 3. Describe an experience in which you were not wearing a mask or a pose, but were sincere. What happened? Then step back from your experience and write on a basis of what you've written. What does it mean to be sincere? Due, Monday, September 14th. Monday, September 14th. Handed in paper 3. Samples of paper 2 were distributed and critiqued, again severely. We learned from older students that these anonymous sample papers were called the shet sheets. The professor too must be tired of these papers and the assignments. He sounds like he's scolding us for writing like we were high school valedictorians, the top student in our class, which many of us were. He was not complimenting us. He gives us the paper 4 assignment. Describe an experience in which you were not sincere. Set the scene. Who was in it? What was said? On the basis of your experience, what does it mean to be insincere? Due Wednesday, September 16th. Wednesday, September 16th. Handed in paper 4. Sheet sheets of paper 3 critiqued. The professor asked, do we know what sincerity is from looking the word up in a dictionary? Or do we know it from experience? He gives us the paper 5 assignment, possibly the one quoting Tolstoy on sincerity in art, due Friday, September 18th. Friday, September 18th. Handed in paper 5. Shit sheets handed out. It is my paper 4 about Mrs. Wong. I am a pakora about to be fried and eaten up. I think you get the idea. 3 times a week. No deviations, no late papers, no extended deadlines, no unwritten papers. Also, no grades on the papers when returned to us with written comments on them. I felt that I had never before been taken seriously by a reader, a teacher. The professor was asking me what I think, not what he thinks or I think he expects. And I realized that I didn't know, had never really known what I think, how, and why. I think my unthinking way of writing paper 1 was the way almost every one of us 300 wrote so seriously for the next day and a half. I wrote that people in a civilized society must assume poses, wear masks, to cover up our wild animal souls and tame and discipline our psyches. I had recently learned the word psyche, so I was showing it off. I turned this thesis into a 1.5-page essay. When on Friday, our professors returned our first papers to us, at the end of my paper one, the professor had written only 4 words in red ink. What is your subject? I didn't understand. I'd written my best prose, poetic even, talking about animals inside of us, writing about society and man and of unruly inner selves that we civilized humans must tame like they were our inner animals, our poses and masks being the signs of our civility, our clothing on top of our naked selves. In a word, we all try to sound like pundits without knowing the origins of this word. When on Monday of the next week, my distinguished professor seemed to scold us, he asked who we thought we were at age 18, writing about society and mankind and real selves. How could we know? How do we know these things or anything else? By then, we were already turning in paper 3, asking us to define sincerity in terms of wearing or not wearing a mask. What does it mean to be sincere? How do you know? 2 days later, on Wednesday, the professor was telling us, don't you know sincerity from your own experience? What experience? There came a time for each of us to shout in our inner selves, and in some cases aloud, something I voice here in the politest way possible for me in response to these seemingly repetitious, nagging assignments. Who the hell gives a damn anyway about mask and sincerity and real selves? This must have happened to me on the Monday the professor scolded us, the beginning of my second week in college. I listened to my professor. I listened to my professor who asked, what experience taught me about sincerity? How? And I was so homesick, so utterly homesick, that I decided to write about an experience of mine for paper 4, the assignment given to us on that Monday. Describe an experience in which you were insincere. On the basis of your experience, what does it mean to be insincere? I was so homesick that I went home, so to speak, by writing. I wrote about home and about my leaving home and a loss of home. I did so by writing the short story of my last conversation with Mrs. Wong, our neighbor farm woman, a granny to us kids, with whom I had a final difficult discussion about how my father had taken over the lease for their farmland, and she and her family were forced to move away. I could not say the words to her, not even to apologize for what my family was doing to hers. And she was wise and caring enough not to blame me for the unspoken issue between us. It was as if before that moment, there'd be no question about our sincerity with each other, a sincerity between the old and the very young. And now, if sincerity means not saying what we were thinking and feeling, deliberately not saying it, then this is how I know the meaning of the word insincerity. I'm weeping even now, writing my memory of this. On the second Friday of the semester, the professors returned paper 4. My paper alone was the shit sheet for paper 4. It was handed to all the English 1 sections and all 300 of my classmates. All the professors read my paper aloud to their class sections. Anyone who knew me already could identify its author. During my 4 years in college, professors who didn't know me would comment that they remember. You were the one who wrote about that peasant woman. The details in my paper revealed who I am. This is what my professor had asked me about paper one. What is your subject? I didn't understand until years later that he might have meant that I am the subject, not society or mankind or a man bound to a duty to assume a pose. I am the subject. The professor let the paper about Mrs. Wong and me stand as an example, saying only, well, somebody understands what we've been asking you to write. That's all. To this day, some of our classmates at the age of 75 are still troubled by the question of who is their real self. My reply is that this question, like the theme of mask and tightly related grilling about sincerity, was not just rhetorical. It was more tricky and sly than that. It presented a red herring. The assignments didn't even presume that there is such a thing as the real self. But we students had assumed that the professors assumed its existence and knew the answer as to what the real self is. I say to some classmates that though they've been searching for their real self for 50 years, trying still to understand our required course, English 1 and 2. But what if there is no such thing, not a fixed and unchanging entity anyway? What if our self is not an absolute thing, but an ever changing experience, a fluid, a story? And what if the point of the assignments was to get us to give up the very notion of a real self? Now, this critique of my classmates and analysis of our course is sounding rather Buddhist, you know? There is no self. All phenomena are illusions. What if our English professors had intuited this? I immediately wrote to my high school English teacher, Barbara Ching, and sent her a copy of my paper, possibly in the form of an extra cheat sheet that I had taken. A classmate who sat beside me in that English 1 class says until now that my paper showed him how to write at Amherst College. 2 days later, our professor returned paper 5 to us on our essays on Tolstoy's assertion that it is sincerity that makes a work of art great and rare. I had reverted to writing like a pundit. My professor wrote on that paper, a good statement, but do you really believe it? I felt as if no one had ever asked or cared to ask me before about whether I really believed whatever I had written. What is belief? I laughed and laughed that the plan seemed to be to praise a student for paper 4, then to break him down again for paper 5. At least I was learning this. The professor and I were already learning from a special unspoken rapport developing between us. Meanwhile, in the story of learning and teaching, as I experienced them, we were simultaneously in a diabolical required physics 1 and 2 course. The professor who ruled over the exactly timed lectures, the door locked so no student could enter late and no students could exit early. Professor Arnold Boris Ahrens had an autographed portrait of Albert Einstein in his office. Ahrens interspersed and paralleled his frequent narratives of the history of Western science with allusions to literature and philosophy. His repeated admonition to us was from Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And from experience, I shudder to think of the day when you will be voting in this country. He would glare at us. At the end of an academic year of his exacting lectures and the laboratory experiments he marshaled us through, Ahrens assigned us a term paper to write. A term paper, not a set of mathematical and quantitative physics problems to solve. He ordered us to tell in our own words how and why Newton formulated his laws of motion, demonstrate these laws in formulas and how Newton derived them, and discuss the geocentric and heliocentric paradigms of the cosmos that Newton had to consider. Finally, respond to the question, which is true, the geocentric model of the universe or the heliocentric model of the solar system and the universe? Physics had been my worst course of study all year. But this time I found I could do something with it by writing a term paper and not having to solve quantitative problems. I wrote, and writing makes me think. The ultimate question in the assignment, the question about truth, must have inspired an epiphany in me. I wrote that neither the geocentric nor the heliocentric model is true, and both can be supported by and expressed in facts. Facts, data are different from the truth, and both can be supported by and it depends on your point of view, as Ahrens had been bullying us to understand all year. Are you gazing at the stars from the point of view of the Earth, the geocentric view in which we can talk of sunrise and sunset? Or are you gazing as if your eyes are on the sun, as in the term solar system? These questions are exercises in relativism. Is truth relative and contingent? So the question, which of these paradigms is true, was again a stinky red herring, and again a terribly and awe-inspiring teaching device. The question did not assume an answer, but begged the question, what is truth? Which we were thereby set free to pursue for the rest of our lives. Among our classmates, I know of only one other who understood the assignments, this assignment as I do, the way I've just now described. I have no idea whether we were right or we were wrong. We have no idea whatsoever what Professor Arnold Boris Ahrens really had in mind, whether he had any answers to impose on us, or his questions were open-ended, philosophical and pedagogical wonders. When afterwards my classmate John actually went to Ahrens to ask what he meant by that term paper assignment, Ahrens just smiled, looking always like a crocodile. In those years, Time magazine would choose and announce the 10 best American college professors of the year. Professor Ahrens was one of them for more than 1 year, and was the only one among the 10 who was frankly characterized as being hated by his students. His response to us, one day you will thank me for what and how I am teaching you. And we'd scoff at him. These absolutely required courses in our first year, joined in the next 3 years by courses and pedagogical examples, for instance, of Professor Leo Marx in American Studies, inspired my ambitions for designing and teaching courses of my own. I should also acknowledge by name the professor who created the English 1-2 composition course, which was legendary and mythical in the American profession of composition and rhetoric. He was Professor Theodore Baird. Behind his back, we'd call him Teddy Bear. A friend described Baird as a man you could hear walking toward you in a hallway from the sound of his pouting. Baird was to me an intellectual giant whose head I could not comprehend, so far up there it was in a rarefied atmosphere. Baird, who was our professor of Shakespeare too, was accurately reputed to have refused a doctoral degree at Harvard, telling them that there was no one at Harvard qualified to examine him. After Amherst, I had the great privilege of teaching English composition and conversation at the Dosha University in Kyoto, Japan. Dosha is associated with Amherst College because the first Japanese graduate of an American university, American college, Joseph Hardy Nijima, Amherst College class of 1870, returned to Japan and founded Dosha. Other historically important Japanese graduates of Amherst have followed after him. I was the Amherst Dosha teaching fellow for 1968 to 1969. This year too was life-changing. Yet I continue to consider the study of Renaissance English literature to be my destined graduate study, which I was to begin the following year at Columbia University in New York City. I studied at Columbia for only a year, then left with a master's degree to return home and teach at the University of Hawaii. Then in 1975, as a graduate student, this time at the University of Washington in Seattle, I switched my emphasis to a new field, Asian American literature. My calling was to become the first member of an English department faculty in America to research and teach about this infant field of literature. This change put me into the profession of American Studies, which Leo Marx had modeled for me. Let me jump ahead to 1989. At the annual conference of the American Studies Association that year, held in Toronto, I was introduced to the president of the Japanese Association for American Studies, Professor Yasuo Sakakibara, an economist and a dean at Tosha University, and a practicing Buddhist priest who was at the conference in Toronto to work on an annual exchange of scholars between the American and the Japanese associations in American studies. It took me a moment to recognize that Saki had been one of my supervisors at Dosha University 20 years earlier. We reunited and thereafter enjoyed a close relationship as if by destiny. My career had thus returned to connections with Japan and Asia. And so, naturally, as if destined, in the summer of 1995, the now Vice Chancellor Sandeep Sastry and I first met in my first visit to India in a conference supported by the Cultural Affairs Officer Catherine Gunning of the United States Consulate in a city then called Madras. The conference was the beginning of what we went on to call the South Indian American Studies Network. I was asked to give an opening speech on something like multiculturalism in American studies. In other words, about the study of cultural and racial diversity. The night before the conference, there was a reception. I was dazzled when introduced to one participant after another, each one telling me, teaching me about his or her Indian state of origin, native language, and religion, some of which I could just barely recognize from having studied a tourist guidebook to South India. The next morning, I got up to speak, soaked already in sweat. My first words were what they had to be. I came here to tell you about multiculturalism, and I find that I have nothing at all to teach you. So many preconceptions and prejudices about America's being exceptionally multicultural and the rest of the world homogeneously monocultural, about the aloofness of professors of Indian origin in America and about my own superiority in American studies by virtue of my being American were sloughing off me like the old skin of a serpent or the old shell of a crab, replaced by a new perception of this world. I did present my prepared talk on multiculturalism, but to me it was now a matter of talking shop and comparing notes with fellow travelers in a worldwide field of studies and colleagues. As for the aloofness of Indian professors and professionals in America, I was now understanding that it was their pose in a society that would otherwise look down on them. I didn't see such condescension by or to anyone in that conference in Chennai, a condescension that still persists in America toward people considered inferior in regard to anything American. Since that conference, Professor Sastry and I have been together numerous times in India and in North America, our families too. From here, I want to give you notes about my experiences in teaching and in learning and research. The following points may sound like 6 pieces of advice, but I don't mean them as such. First, I found that being a professional teacher would well be complemented by being a student at the same time. For me, I've been under the teacher's commands in the following situations while I was a teacher myself. As a deckhand on my father's deep sea fishing boat, his lifelong hobby and obsession, understanding that there is only one captain on a ship. Um, as an actor on stage under a trusted director, the only one director on the set, please, as a tenor in our church choir under our director, and as a of member of Aikido martial arts dojos with only one instructor on the mat at a time. All lessons I learned about my being the underling in these activities fed my own experiences as a teacher of students, sometimes struggling to understand me and our studies, as I sometimes struggled on ship and stage. Second, as I think you already infer, my Amherst College way of education was formative. But before I began teaching, I vowed not to repeat what my college teachers had done. They had seemed to me to be arcanely inexplicit about what their questions were aiming at. I understood that they might be trying not to tell us what to think, but were trying to force us to understand how we think. I decided that when I teach, I would try to explain this strategy, this distinguishing between what to think and how to think. When students would ask me, I would explain anything they thought were secrets I was withholding, subtexts, and ulterior motives for anything I was asking, assuming, or assigning. I, of course, found, however, that the further I went in this direction, and the more complex my own thoughts and analyses were becoming, the more demanding I had to be in my discussions with my students in regard to why I was asking this or that of them, and to avoid being evasive about how and why the questions mattered to me. Over the years, I was explaining more and more about my asking them to try out the processes and logics that might lead either to my conclusions or to their own. Third, as in all social relations and interactions, teaching is mostly dialogical, not monological. The time comes, however, when you have more to say to your students than dialogue can enable you to give to them. You find you need to lecture and to trust your students to listen. This may be a peculiarly American pedagogical concern, In the 1970s, when American students demanded more of a say in their courses, and classroom discussion among students became one of the highest priorities in university classrooms, the role of professors as the sole speakers in lectures changed. Professors were told to encourage classroom discussion, students' participation in their own learning and their own productions of knowledge. And professors would be evaluated by how well they enabled discussions to occur, as evaluated by students. In our first instructors meeting of the composition program of the English department of the University of Hawaii, my first full-time teaching appointment in an American university in 1970, the director of composition, a leader in his field, told us staff members, there is nothing more daunting than the Asian girl sitting in the front row who looks up at you and never speaks a word in class. He was telling us that a pedagogical goal was for us to get that typical girl to participate in our discussions. Among the 20 or so instructors of composition in that meeting, I was the only one from Hawaii, the only one who grew up playing, laughing, fighting, talking stories, crying, shouting with local Asian girls like that. I was confronted by a stereotype in what our director said, and I argued against stereotyping like that, the very kind that silenced the local Asian girls and boys in University of Hawaii English classes. I planned instead to let discussion happen or not happen in the classroom, according to students' own inclinations. In my composition classes, I devised series of assignments modeled on the Amherst College ones, except for my requiring a paper only once every 2 classes rather than in every class meeting. Those assignments themselves provoked the students to speak up, if not in the classroom, then certainly in their papers. In this sense, they were never, never silent. Fourth, as I neared my planned retirement from a profession, I was rather pleased to find that my cumulative research in interdisciplinary, literary Asian American studies was being depleted at just the rate that would allow me to retire at the time when I would run out of new research to feed my teaching. While this symmetry was happening, I felt increasingly that I had gotten myself as an aging teacher to where my students were my closest daily colleagues. Otherwise, we faculty colleagues did not pay as close attention to one another's teachings and research as our students were required to give us. Readers of our books and scholarly articles could be closer to us than our busy departmental colleagues were. In my career, I've been in many faculty meetings bemoaning our lack of an intellectual life within our departments, meaning that we should hold regular colloquia featuring our own colleagues speaking about their work. You know how this idea quickly feels like yet another burden on our time and attention, which we devote instead to reading the scholarship of people elsewhere and attending and applauding the guest lectures by a parade of visitors we invite. But our students have to be with us throughout the term for us to present to them in various ways our current research and the wisdom we've gained from years of experience in the field. 3 years before my planned retirement, I told my students this in a course on comparative American ethnic literature with 150 students in my twice weekly lecture sessions. They appreciated being recognized as my closest colleagues. They performed their roles attentively and in some kind of common cause. They didn't have to speak up in class discussions while I lectured, and I had plenty to say. Their class section meetings on Fridays were reserved for their discussions. I had especially learned this method of alternating lectures with discussions when teaching at the University of Michigan from 1990 to 1999. 50 faculty members, graduate students, and administrators developed, and I co-taught, a course called Race, Racism, and Ethnicity. It was a large, controversial course. The teaching staff would lecture or present films or performances twice a week in front of 200 students or more. Fridays were devoted to discussion sections of 25 students each. In my Friday section, some students immediately took charge by igniting discussions about racism. When I tried to speak up, a student told me to shut up, go sit in a corner, and listen. I had had my 2 hours of lecturing for the week. Now it was their turn to talk. Funny, but I loved this command from a student representing her class. I've thus learned my lesson. I listened. Fifth, about the Aikido in the title of this talk. Aikido is a Japanese martial art that I began practicing when I arrived at Dosha University to teach English in 1968. It is not a martial, it is a martial art, not a sport, in that our style of Aikido has no contests and therefore no restrictive rules by which to score points. To describe Aikido poetically, it's an art of going with the flow of action, both as follower and as director of the action at the same time. It is not a martial art in that it has been called an art of peace instead. In one of the regular seminars in our dojo, our school of Aikido in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the invited master teacher taught us how to act, to perform any action whatsoever, and especially in the physical, mental, philosophical, and spiritual discipline of Aikido. Be aware that even in a split second, we follow this sequence, he said. Observe, analyze, decide, and then act. Don't get hung up on any one of these steps. Move through the sequence. He didn't say this. He didn't say this, but the lesson also applied to the practice of meditation, where observations, analyses, decisions, and consequent actions continually flow through the mind. And the mind is empty in a sense of being continually emptied. The sequence is a formula meant to be simple, to remind learners and teachers how to blend thought and action. Sixth and finally, Aikido can teach the poetics in the title of this talk. For example, when applied to a lesson conducted by Robert Frost, the poet who taught at Amherst College and who never have heard of Aikido. A student remarked that the universe is a machine. Frost asked in reply, "Do you mean the universe is like a machine?" The student must have felt intimidated by authority. Frost continued, "Is the universe a machine or is it like a machine? Have you ever seen a machine that didn't have a lever to pull, a button to push, a pedal to step on, or screws and nuts and bolts to hold it together? Is the universe like that with such parts to it?" Hesitating further, the student remained speechless. Frost, do you mean that the universe is like a machine, which implies that it is also unlike a machine? The student was regaining his composure and said, "Well, I suppose I mean that the universe is like a machine and unlike a machine too. Yeah, not that it is a machine." Frost continued, "This is the life of a metaphor. It has its boundaries beyond which it doesn't apply. Poetry toys with these boundaries, for instance, in similes and metaphors in which like and unlike interact. What Frost performed is a basic technique called tenkan, a circular movement of the body in Aikido. He took the student's assertion, questioned it, uh, and turned it around until the student arrived at the point where Frost was waiting for him. Now the two of them in consonance. In effect, Frost led the student from disagreement with Frost challenging him with the questions to agreement with Frost to an understanding only ostensibly about the universe. Because I began practicing Aikido at the same time I began teaching in any university, for me, the two arts are concurrent, overlapping in time and substance. With such an experience, I have been fortunate to be a learner and a teacher.
So now I'll open this floor for any questions that my colleagues have. You may raise your hand, unmute, and ask the question to Professor Sumida directly, or you may just post it out here and I'll ask it on your behalf. Please go ahead. Yes, so let me start with that. And the first question comes from one of my colleagues, Sandeep Surange. And he's asking, why is there a high level of racism in US and Australia, in spite of being liberal and intellectual societies and with a long history of democracy? Why is it so much of a level of racism?
Yeah. Well, of course, this is not only of perennial concern for us in American studies, for instance, in here, but it's of a special concern in this past year with new attention to our racial crisis. Let me just say that right now there is a response, a counterattack, a pushback against what is called critical race theory, which is a set of which is an epistemology, shall we say, of knowledge about the legal aspects of the history of race and racism in America. And without understanding this at all, there are people in legislatures in America that are pushing back against critical race studies to say that this should be banned from education. In Texas, for instance. But it is there. It is there anyway, because we have this long history, as Professor Surangi has asked about. It's been there from the beginning, and this is what our studies show us. Racism has been there from the beginning. I mean, how else is there an America that is taken from the indigenous people of the continents of America? This historical weight is very, very difficult to put down. It just persists and continues on. It's widely seen as a problem, as a hypocrisy against democracy in America. But then again, even the term democracy and the concept of democracy is conflicted, because democracy to people who may object to a critical race study approach to American history, people who may object say, well, democracy means majority rules. So that's it. You know, we are the majority, but they are not the majority. They are not the majority. And also, when you think about it, if it's always majority rules, then so-called people who are minorities never have a chance. You see? So there's a conflict and tension there. And all these things are to be questioned and brought out for people, you know, to try to understand. It happens, I suppose, at many individual levels, but systemically throughout America, it is a persistent problem and one that it just does not go away. I don't know how else to answer this question.
We have Dr. Devanshu Shrivastava who wants to ask a question directly. Devanshu, you may go ahead, please.
I was really fascinated learning about you. You have been an academician par excellence and a theater artist, a martial artist, and whatnot. So I'll just take this personal question from you there, that learning from all the, because these are three variant aspects that we as an academician never would have seen across. So as a seasoned academician, as a theater artist, as a martial artist, one thing common in all three that you think is a necessity or a piece of advice for all young academicians like us from your end, it would be really nice to have it, sir.
My point actually is that I do think that it's a good thing for teachers to be aware that they are also learning at the same time, and to be that much more conscious and sensitive in a way to what their students' experience may be at the same time. So it almost doesn't matter what kind of activity you can consider yourself a student in. My wife, she and I retired in 2016 together at the same time from teaching at the University of Washington, same department. Our offices next door to each other. She's a historian. I'm the literature, person in the department, and she took up ukulele playing in her retirement, and I think that's really wonderful that she does that very assiduously as a student, and has learned over several years now, and is doing that. So it doesn't matter, it sounds really grand to say martial artist and theater artist like that, but we have any kind of activity in which we are learning, and we're giving giving up ourselves, so to speak, in order to let in the teaching of somebody else. And this reciprocity is just an important principle to me.
Professor Stephen, there's another question which is, leading from the one that you answered a moment back, is how far should a professor lead the discussions in a classroom and thoughts in a particular direction? And how far should they leave it for the students to discover and arrive at themselves? Something which you went through.
Yeah. I think that finally, I use the word ultimately, but that sounds, really like existential matter or something like that. But finally, it's the student who arrives at any thought and idea. So there is inherently the possibility of originality in a student's thinking. And I think this needs to be fostered, needs to be nourished in some way. But when I speak about the Robert Frost example of how he got the student from disagreeing to being like-minded, in consonance with himself, with Frost himself, I think of experiences of mine in class where this has happened, and students have kind of been in awe of this. To say, how can you take a student's contrary idea, and after 30 seconds, that student comes around to agreeing with you and thinking that it was his idea in the first place, and that's something that I appreciated hearing, and it happens to coincide with what we learned in the martial art. But leading the students, when it comes to grading, that's where it's difficult. How do I grade the students then? I think very basically what I try to do is to try to see the internal logic of what the student is arguing, the internal logic of it, and does it stand up? And if it stands up and I still disagree with the conclusions, then I tell them, and they can make of it the disagreement what they want to make of it. But sometimes this is not only the best we can do, but it is the best we can do. Stand face to face in disagreement with a student who has argued clearly.
It's a very natural gradient that they're finding. The next question which comes is again very close to the one you responded, is there are sometimes conflict between the teacher and the learner. How it can be prevented? And this is coming from my colleague Anita Lada, ma'am.
It was the example I gave from University of Michigan. When the student told me to shut up, in the first discussion section in our very big and controversial course. I was taken aback, sure, but soon I began to enjoy this give and take, this back and forth, this conflict. I began to enjoy it. In a place like University of Michigan, and Sandeep knows this pretty well too, because he's has other friends there too, and he's come to University of Michigan. One of the hallmarks of the University of Michigan was disagreement and conflict, and much was made of this. It's a very intense place when it comes to that. So when there is a conflict, it's not something I think to be evaded or avoided, or something to be smoothed over, to be quelled, to be uh, uh, put out like a fire. Although we always talked about um, having to put out fires at the University of Michigan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So two very interesting questions come from one of our professors, Geetu ma'am. And these two questions, I want to put it in front of you. One is says that as put by you, sir, data and facts are different from truth. I understand this, from my discipline of economics, but how do you look at it from an English literature's lens? This data and facts being contrary to the truth.
First of all, I think from the profession or discipline or undiscipline of English literary studies, cultural studies, and whatnot, we would prefer to avoid asking about the truth, because we would be the first to say, well, I don't know anything about the truth, and I don't know and care very much about the facts either. I deal with fictions, I deal with stories, I deal with things that become, I deal with discursive things, that is, ideas that exist because they are put into words, into discourse. And I don't know about facts and about truth. But I grew old, and I had to consider such things as important in our lives, facts and truth, like that. So I brought that into my work in literature. I don't go around in my classes talking about the difference between facts and truth or the relationship between them. Maybe twice or three times in my 48 years of teaching, I have told a story about Professor Ahrens and his term paper assignment, where I think anyway, he got us to say, these are the facts. These are the data by which we make our theories, our paradigms, our systems. But the truth is something else. I'll give you another example that I have more commonly used. Once, when I was teaching that first year in Japan at Tosha University, during the winter vacation, winter break, actually, the school year ends in January in Japan, typically in January. Then the new school year, university school year, begins in April or May. But anyway, during that break in the winter time, when the practical use of having a break then is to save on heating costs of the university classrooms, because 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 of the winter and not having classes. But I was encouraged, and I did make a journey through Southeast Asia, and I ended up being stranded, being stuck on a small island between Indonesia and the Philippines. I won't go into the story, but in its entirety. But it had kind of a cosmic meaning to me. And I was troubled by this experience for a good year. And a year later at Columbia University, because of my English studies there, Renaissance English studies, 17th century British literature, studies of John Milton and his Paradise Lost, great, great, great epic, English epic. Um, I had kind of a revelation or conversion experience, and it was this. It occurred to me that the day or the night when I was able to leave that island, because a boat actually came and took some of us, a trading boat from the Philippines actually came and took some of us back into Indonesia, where we were ordered to go, and we could make our way back to our homes from there. That night, in my fiction, in my story, is that that night was the how do we say, vernal equinox on that island in the tropics, right? On that day, the sun was directly overhead at noon. So if I were standing on a beach at noon, I would cast no shadow. You see, that's how in a Christian cosmology, according to John Milton, that's the state that Adam and Eve were in the Bible before the fall of humankind, before their sin. When they were in the perfect garden as perfect creations themselves, they cast no shadow at 12 noon. The sun was directly overhead. So I said, that's what happened to me on that island. That's how I left. In other words, the gates of paradise were open on that day and one other day, you know, 6 months later. And that's all. Only twice a year it'll happen at any one place in the tropics. I said, that's what happened. And then I said, wait. If it's a gate of paradise, wait. Think about this. If it's a gate of paradise, the other side of the gate of paradise is the gate of hell. It's the same gate. It's the same gate. It depends on which side you're coming from. And I don't know which way I came from and which way I was going. But it's the same gate, that's all. And to me, then, forever after, in that moment of thinking this paradox that it's the same gate, that to me is my only chance as a human being to perceive, to experience truth when opposites are equally valid at the same time. You see, and actually, if you examine my talk carefully, you will see that that is kind of a basis for a lot of my thinking. But that was it. So I felt very, how can I say? I felt very grounded in this experience and in this perception, and I felt that I had a basis for speaking, for being the subject of what I'm saying and of teaching. And there are a lot of other people in my profession, colleagues and everyone who said to me, you know, how can you be so sure? You know, as if you know the truth. I said, well, I don't say that I know the truth. I think everybody has experienced it. It's just that I thought about it in a certain way. But I feel that things get put into order, you know, so that my courses could have rationales to them, you know, like a literature course, Asian American literature course. Oh, every year, let's just add any new work that was published in the past year, and you know, we'll discard the old ones from the syllabus. No, that's not a method. There's got to be a method and some theory that supports this decision making.
although Gitu ma'am also asks a question which is part of your narration today, is in your teaching career, did you find your students to be more sincere or more masked?
Well, okay. One of the ways I interpreted, this is years later now, I interpreted the English 1 series of assignments about masks versus sincerity and all of that, was that, you know, all those questions had to do with writing. Basically, does your writing reveal what it is you want to say, you believe, you think, whatever? Does it reveal or does it conceal? You see, words are masks, in other words. And that's what the course is about. It's about words. Are your words masks or are they presentations or representations of what you mean? And so both the masking and the sincerity are there as possibilities every time. It has to do with the motives and understanding and questions that the writer has. So my example of this was because eventually, we had 30 something assignments throughout that first semester alone. 30 something assignments, maybe more. And along the way, they gave us the opportunity to think, maybe to think about this. We've been thinking that masks hide who we are, not sincere. But I said, the holiday, so to speak, of Halloween here in a Western world. It's when children dress up in costume, like superhero costume, right? And I said, that's children wearing masks deliberately to reveal that night that they go around the neighborhood, they are that superhero. It's to reveal themselves. The mask is to reveal themselves, not to hide themselves. And I said, that's why, we're confused and turning around and around in this course, because you say one thing and it means the opposite at the same time, or it can mean the opposite at the same time. Yeah. So I am sensitive about how students may be writing in ways that conceal more than they reveal.
Wow.
And the trouble is they're not aware.
There's a question which comes up, Professor Stephen, if you can take that. It comes from Professor Shoaib Khan, Dr. Shoaib Khan. How would you relate Aikido experience to teaching or learning experience? Is it the discipline or responding the person in front of you with no harm? How do you relate this Aikido and teaching experience?
The discipline of Aikido, in terms of this question that Professor Lada is asking, is just a means to relating with the student, person who's trying to learn or is trying to tell me something that's different from what I'm trying to say. Yeah. I spoke about the technique called Tenkan, which is a circular movement. The other basic movement is a straight line movement. You enter into the other person's space. Okay. So, for instance, if somebody is going to punch you, I suppose the typical untrained reaction to this is to move away and to get ready to punch back. In Aikido, straight line, go right into that person. So the person punches, but you're already in his face. You know, his punch can go nowhere, and you're already inside. Um, and this is a useful metaphor for some kinds of confrontations. You know, some kinds of confrontations. Um, and even just to be a good neighbor, sometimes a neighbor comes to you with a complaint that your dog is barking too much, too early in the morning, waking me up. And the neighbor comes belligerently, expecting you to fight back against this complaint. But you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. You know, I stopped going out with the dog at 4 o'clock in the morning myself, so I just let the dog out into the yard." And I said, besides that, you know, there are a lot of missing cats in our neighborhood. Missing cats, pet cats. Okay, you see signs up on a telephone pole saying "missing cat." You know, have you seen my cat? They are mostly victims of coyotes. That is a dog-like, wolf-like, small creature that eat cats and small dogs. So I said, you know, besides, my dog doesn't usually bark just because he went out to relieve himself, at 4 o'clock in the morning, but because he knows there's a coyote there. And the neighbor says, "What?" So the would-be confrontation ends up being, some sort of agreement there, just by entering in a straight line. Yeah.
Nice.
Um, so it's just kind of a parallel. It's a metaphor. Aikido uses a metaphor.
Anshika ma'am wants to know. There's another question, Professor. She says, "Greetings. Can you please suggest how students' questions posing capability used as means of evaluating higher order thinking? How do we nurture our students in the question posing capabilities?"
Yeah. It has taken me a long time to understand, really. I accepted and tried to practice the idea that we're teaching our students how to question. Questions are the most important part of our tactics and what we are imparting through our courses and our teaching and all of that. I knew that. I mean, people, I've heard that and everything, but I didn't understand very much, to tell you the truth. I took it in a rather literal-minded way. I think that um, well, my example is this. Let's say, uh, in a okay, let's say in a book. This is an Asian American literature book. It's a Japanese American literature novel, a classic. It's called No No Boy. No No Boy was that person who refused military service during World War II because he and his family and 120,000 other Japanese Americans were put into concentration camps. So he refused to join the army when he was recruited, when he was drafted. And so he became a traitor. He became cast as a traitor or as a weak link in the community. And he was actually put in federal uh, prison for 2 years for so-called draft evasion. So he is the lowest person in the community when he returns from prison after World War II. He returns to Seattle. He is the lowest person in that society because he has been branded a traitor. He himself believes that he is a traitor. He feels terribly guilty and ashamed for what he did. So he renounces himself, but can't get out of his situation. So the question was, why did the author choose to write about the lowest member of society rather than the highest example as a role model? The highest example in that community being the Japanese American soldier who went to war, became a war hero, survived, and returned to Seattle. You know, why didn't the author John Okada was his name write about that returning veteran, that war hero? And there were reasons why I can say, but anyway, the end result was my saying that, you see, if you write about the highest hero in the society, that's one kind of role model and lesson that you can present to society. But nobody would really want to repeat that person, that hero's experience. You would have to make war, you would have to go to war, you would have to experience all of that terror and everything else. You know, you don't, that's not the point of an example like that. But if the hero or anti-hero is the lowest person in society, if that person can survive in this fictional exploration of a year in his life, if he can survive, then everyone has a chance. He's the lowest guy. He can survive. Everyone has a chance. So that is a question and an answer. Then one of my graduate students at the University of Michigan put it this way. She said, you know, this is well and good, but you know, the questions that we've been asking are questions that all seem to have some answer. You can interpret the text, in other words, and you can get an answer. But what about questions that don't have answers? Like that question, why is America still persistently racist? You know, no matter that this guy can survive, this hero can survive, and so we all can survive, but still the problem is there. Why? You see, so that's another kind of question that we have to get to also, the unanswerable questions, at least not answerable right now. It's called Smoke Signals, and the screenplay is by my former student and colleague, the Native American writer, Sherman Alexie, who is a novelist who is quite well known here. And in the film, a man who rescues a boy, a baby, from a burning house is very flustered and confused about being the hero. And the grandmother of the baby boy says, thank you, you saved my boy's life. And he says, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. What he's hiding, what he's referring to, actually he's revealing, is that it was he who started the fire, that burned the house down accidentally. It was he, and he only he knows that he started fire. So when she says, thank you for saving my baby, and he says, I didn't mean to.